So my name is Alexey Sidorenko, and I'm traveling in between two countries, like both neighbors of Ukraine. And Teplitsa is the largest civic tech Russian language portal out there, with 20% of readers coming from Ukraine. Within the last 4 years, it was 1 million of Ukrainian readers, which make us all in Teplitsa, who live in many countries, very proud. And today I will be speaking about sharing data and code. And before I start, I'd like to stay with this quote, and forgive my Ukrainian. І не забуваємо творити добро і ділитися тим, що маємо з іншими. Who knows where it comes from? Yeah, that's New Testament. Thank you. Well, I didn't get the second part because my first point is that sharing is deeply embedded in our culture through different textual narratives, whether you believe it or not. And then, at this point, I was asked to explain what is open source and open data, and why sharing in culture and open data and code is important for the 21st century. So at almost 5 o'clock of today, who doesn't still get the idea of open source code and open data? It's a good time to raise your hands. Just one. Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So I have a personal story. So in my childhood, I went to my friend's place, and granny of my friend, let's call her Aunt Rosa. So she used to make these pancakes. And this picture is just for copyright reasons. This picture doesn't resemble the real wet pancakes. I really love them. And every time I wanted my parents, my mom, to cook it, I just begged, please, could you do the same wet pancakes? And she would call Aunt Rosa and ask for the recipe. And I know the recipe is what Richard Stallman compares open source code to. So she would call, and my mom would get the ingredients, would get the recipe, but it still was, something not. So if we have a program and we compare it to the recipe, well, it's not the same. But the good thing about the 21st century is that programs can actually make you much better. So you can actually share it and use it for modification and enhancement. And what is open data in the kitchen context? Well, we thought of different metaphors of using it as something like a light, water to cook, but basically it's the data about the consumption. For example, Aunt Rosa knew exactly that one person would eat 3 pancakes and the other, and it was through many iterations, and if she could share it with her neighbors, so the neighbors wouldn't waste food. Well, that's at least where my metaphor for open data is. So it can be reused and redistributed and used many times. And if open source and open data are so good, why still it's not so much of it? And throughout 4 years that we've been working with the NGOs, and I will present here an NGO project, and also the project that helps other NGOs. We've met a number of fears. So the first fear is that they will steal my precious code. Well, we have now 23 public repositories, and there was not a single time when it was maliciously coded in order to steal or to make money on it. The second part is, well, I'm too shy for my code. And usually just people, don't want to publish it because it sucks. Well, and my recommendation here, just be brave. Ukrainians are very brave. People around the world, activists, are brave. So just be brave and publish it. Once you will, like everyone, they will accuse you that your code sucks, but on the second time it will be much better, because you will know where it sucks. Otherwise, you don't. The second thing is about the data, and it's kind of the same. And like we all ask, and like how many of you are working in an NGO? Okay, good. How many of you had ever published a report? How many of you had ever published the source data for your report? Wow. Okay. How many of you feel that your report data is stretched, incomplete, inconsistent? Okay. Yeah. So basically, it's the same argument. Once like if your data is inconsistent, maybe you shouldn't make conclusions based on it. So think of it. And basically, open data for your source, if you're an NGO, also makes you well. Then there comes this Dr. Evil thing. Like the bad guys will use my open data. And my point of view is that unless it's a private data and something that Maria was telling about that relates to people, usually more data is a friend of open and democratic societies because it brings so much more knowledge and information and transparency. So even though that some of it might be used, and we need to separate the good open data, which helps us all, from the bad open data and it's not even open, but basically it's being collected with our knowledge of consent. And we need to defend one and promote the other. Then the usual situation is that, open data, but we don't have any sources of open data. We as an NGO don't have anything to share. How many of you do feel this way, that you don't have anything interesting to share? How many of you feel that you want to share, but you still didn't do that? Okay, thank you for your hands. That's good to know. And basically, sometimes, it also happens. For example, there is openlist.wiki. It's a list of politically repressed in the Soviet Union. And it has 2.5 million of data units. And do you know what format it is not published in? Right, it's not published in the format of open data, because the developers didn't think of it. So my recommendation that I will repeat later, think of everything what you publish as an open data and machine readable. Because you can actually do great things. The crisis center data, for example, publish it is in an open data format, the text, anonymized text of crisis data messages. And it's like 20 million data units that you can analyze, and some of it you can analyze right on the website. For others, because it's sensitive data, you have to be approved. But still, what can you do with it? You can do so much more pattern research that can actually help victims of the crisis and actually save lives and make much more people happier. So, the advantages of open source. And I'm telling you this on our own experience. First of all, you can scale it up. And if you are not publishing it in open source or open data, you should start. Because, for example, IT Volunteer, that's a matchmaking platform that we developed for ourselves, but we also wanted to make it usable for everything, and you can also use it. So this is the original platform, and this is what we've created 5 hours for a completely different reason, to connect volunteers, volunteer lawyers in the crisis center to help women who suffered from domestic violence to submit their applications for police that are usually being rejected because the subjects of gender violence do not know how to write these applications, because once it happens, you didn't have much experience writing it. Online Leica, that's a fundraising plugin that helps to fundraise money in millions of rubles right now, which is also open source. And instead of developing it for yourself, you can just translate it to your language and add a payment system module, which is also open source. and it saves you, well, a significant amount of time, and it also could help you collect money for your NGO. It's also much easier to manage your team and receive feedback. For example, this is how I know that developers in Teplitsa are working, and I believe that they are working, but I also know exactly what they are working on right now because I have their updates in Slack. How many of you use Slack, by the way? I know Anna uses it. Yeah, that's good. So it also creates higher standards of coding and data collection because openness creates constraints, and constraints lead us to perfection. And this is all about the openness, about being better, about having everyone looking at us. So what they say, dance like no one is watching and code like everyone is. I like this guy. And it's also much easier to evaluate the community engagement. There is a joke. It is that the most important thing to ask yourself every day is to ask, am I doing the right thing? Am I not doing some crap? Pardon my French. And I guess the community engagement in the coding community is really important because if they fork, they care. Do I have to explain what fork means? It's basically when you copy a code and you use it for purposes, like for your own purposes, making your own. So if we know that people actually make the code their own, we know that it actually is somehow usable. And this is something for you as NGOs actually to use as a measurement technique, whether in your development project, in your NGO project, you publish it as an open source and you set it up in your aims that you actually want to engage the citizens, engage the citizen developers. Well, that's how you measure it. I've heard today something that also makes me, I guess it was Krzysztof Izdebski who said that there is so much more about the open source and open data because it actually helps you to have something unexpected. And serendipity, it's the English word that I really like, and it comes from the Persian tale of three princes of Serendip. And the funny thing about these three princes that they would always discover something they were not in the quest of. It's like like starting a Wikipedia on one page and just waking up 2 hours after, like just reading and reading it all over again. And this is exactly what open source and what open data inhibits, allows us for. And this is also, this leads me to another thing about the open data. And I guess, people in this country love freedom. So imagine that code and data also should be free. Isn't it a good thing to have? Just, free them up. So my recommendations, and I have just 1 minute. So for the NGOs, think scalability and transparency. To the governments, open up your data and your code. Not just data, but your data and your code. To the society, expect open source and data. Imagine if we could open up the processes, what Oleg was saying, how the processes work, and this is code, like of post-service, of public transportations, of election, of police, legislation, taxes. Imagine that we can get into the process and you say, hey, like here's my pull request, please change this because it makes much more sense. And this process is actually public. To the donors, and this is really important, this is where you can really make a change. Require that, whatever the NGOs are doing, it's open source and open data. And finally, I'd like to come back to where I started. Regardless you believe or not the religious text, that constitute a significant part of our culture, but to the developers, do not forget to do good and to share it with others. Thank you very much.
Alex, thanks a lot. And still there is a question, you know, are there really the cases and the moments when you understand that maybe it's way too early to share, maybe it's the time to leave it for yourself? Are these the cases? I'm not speaking about the privacy data, but still.
Well, so as for the NGOs, I think there is a number of things where you actually get into the gray zone that might affect the personal data. So if you go, you know, like down to, you know, like where it can, you know, help the bad guys actually to make, you know, like to also to make their own pattern research and, you know, to
So where is for you this red line between the privacy and openness? Because, you know, we hear also a lot, unless you open the whole data, you would be called like a closed organization whatsoever. You know, everybody have all the kind of notifications like and demands.
Well, that's a very good question. I would say that any information that, if opened up, and we know it by some history of you know, closing environments, that it can help to target and threaten a person, it should not be yet opened.
Okay, thank you, Alexey Sidorenko.
Yeah. Thank you.